The World Championship match between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Magnus Carlsen begins at the end of November, and in the run-up to that I'm looking at some of their past games to see what might actually take place in the match. Well, I'm going right back to their days when they played in junior tournaments. We've already seen one from 2002. And this game was played in the World Under-14 Championship in 2003. And it is a really tense game in all its phases. Nepo with the white pieces. C3 Sicilian, and Carlsen plays with D5, of course, one of the main ways of responding to this opening. And in this position, of course, main move is Knight F6, G6 from Carlsen. So this injects a little bit more dynamism into the position. Knight A3, but it's a risky line because Black's development is suffering a little bit. And, you know, there are some very interesting tricks here, as we're about to see. Pawn takes pawn. In fact, Carlsen has had this position in 2020 against Giri and played knight b5. It's also an interesting move. But bishop c4 is great fun. If the queen goes back, then white, well, you can see white's development is tremendous here. That's the game. Sveshnikov against Svitan, Tilburg 1993. Yevgeny Sveshnikov, who died sadly in the summer, was a great pioneer of c3. He turned this into a serious weapon for white. Queen e4 check played. And now bishop e3. The big trick here is pawn takes bishop and then bishop takes f7 check, winning the queen. Of course, Nepo wasn't inventing this. This is actually quite a well-known variation. So knight h6 from Carlsen defends the pawn on f7. Knight b5. So the king has to watch out again if pawn takes bishop. Then knight check and queen d8. So castles from Carlsen. Yeah, now it's too much to play knight c7 and pawn takes bishop. So pawn takes pawn, and now here Carlsen played knight a6, which is a pretty poor square for the knight. In fact, well, later practice showed that actually knight f5 is the best move here. Knight c7 isn't particularly good. That actually leads to a draw. I mean, black has great activity. Black is fine there. Actually, listen, let me just show that, because there's a very neat trick. So this was a game played in 2015, Pap against Boruchovsky, and here the trick is this: bishop h3, and that leads to a draw like this, and so on. So that's the theory. Anyway, knight f5 is the best move. But knight a6 played by Carlsen. It's not a good square for the knight. And here queen b3 has been played previously, and that, well, played actually in the game in 2003, and that's probably the best move. But what Nepo did is also pretty promising. Knight c3 and queen b3. And I think this is the problem with the whole variation for black, that this queen gets booted around. Well, you can see the knights on the edge. It looks pretty strange. White's development is very classical and looks pretty promising. So, yeah, black is already under pressure here. And, well, typically for Carlsen, I say typically, you know, that's said with a great deal of hindsight. We know the kind of player he is now. But Carlsen seeks solace in the endgame. We've seen him do that so many times before. When he's under pressure, he's happy to accept a slightly worse endgame. You know, his technique is superb, and you know he even had that trait at this young age this is in 2003. Let me see, Carlsen would have been, well, he was almost 13 when this game was played. And Nepo was already 13. So an exchange of queens, and it's obvious that white is better here. This pawn is weak. White has excellent development. The knight on e6 at the moment isn't terribly good. But watch what happens. Knight d6 from Carlsen. Now, he was obviously thinking that after knight takes pawn, he would have decent survival chances here. You can see that after, well, let's say bishop e6, now black's position makes sense. Two really nice bishops. This knight might well come into d5, maybe b4 and then perhaps d5. Black has good compensation there. You know, that's what Carlsen was angling for. But Nepo was alert to that. And instead of giving up his bishops, he played bishop b3. This is good chess. So he's not plunging in straight away. And Nepo obviously looking to play this position where he hasn't won a pawn, but black's pieces look pretty rotten there. That knight is superbly placed on b6. But again, Carlsen alert to that and happy to give up a pawn to get more activity. He played knight b4, and after knight takes pawn, then the rook has a square on a6, which means that this knight can be dislodged from this square. And if, well, I mean, this is possible for white. I mean, it's possible to take this bishop and play like this, but black does have some activity there. You know, the knights look pretty good, bishop on g7, but yeah, I mean, maybe this knight can hop in here. I mean, black does have some compensation. So knight d5 from Nepo. So he's a pawn up and things looking pretty good, but Carlsen is battling. At least, you know, he has decent development here. But, you know, Nepo is definitely better. Rook a5. Pushes the bishop back. And now a nice maneuver from Carlsen. Bishop e4. And you can see from this little switch with the bishop, he's got his bishop on this absolute rock of a square on c6, supported by the b7 pawn. It closes the c-file. The bishop on this excellent diagonal. And, you know, for me, you know, even at this young age, Carlsen had these hallmarks of recognizing, you know, where his pieces should go. You know, he had already a very strong positional feel. So that bishop's superb on c6. Knight on d6 isn't badly placed as well. So he's making sense of his pieces. He's a pawn down, but he's fighting. Now the computer recommendation here is knight c4. But, you know, after those exchanges, it's a pretty stable position for black. And, you know, you can imagine perhaps a rook ending being reached where, you know, there's a little bit of pressure here. Basically, you know, Carlsen, I can imagine, would be pretty comfortable with that position or confident he could make a draw there. And I think, you know, Nepo recognise that as well, that actually in those kind of positions it's hard to convert that extra pawn. So, you know, he was playing for more in this position. He played bishop c2 instead of simplifying. Bishop comes around here, so he's trying to claim some squares. Here actually, I mean, Carlsen is already fine. For example, with this move, rook a4, hitting this pawn, and then putting the pawn on, putting the rook on a3. You know, potentially doubling here. Basically, black has enough compensation for the pawn, but instead Carlsen went with rook d5. And rook h5, so a bit of an adventure with the rook. And here, well, I mean, Carlsen is wanting to play knight f5. So Nepo plays a brave move now. g4. Controlling f5, obviously. But to play a move like this is very risky. It opens up the king. Now, you might say at the moment that's not a big deal, it's an endgame, but actually with so many pieces on the board, that's still risky. The pawn move looks very loose to me. But, you know, Nepo's the kind of player that is prepared to take those kind of risks. And again, this is said with a great deal of hindsight, but we do see that in his play. You know, he's prepared to play slightly unorthodox moves to take risks in order to try and convert an advantage. Knight b5. Carlsen building up pressure. Bishop c4 hits the rook back. And now knight e5. And here the best move is to play the bishop back to e8. Carlsen plays e6. So cutting the bishop here, blocking the bishop. And here Nepo misses a good chance. He should take on c6, eliminate that strong bishop, and simply play a4. Giving back the pawn, but, well, watch out for tricks here. So rook a2, and this a pawn is strong. Good chances. Or knight a7, a5 again, just give up that d pawn and push the a pawn. White certainly with a serious advantage there. But instead, Nepo went for bishop takes knight, a4, and he pushed the pawns in another way. So, you know, this also looks like White has a pretty serious initiative. Maybe just looking to advance the queenside pawns. And, you know, there's also potential to play rook c7 at some point. But, yeah, b5 will stop that bishop coming to c6. But Carlsen comes up with an excellent idea to fight back. He realizes that, you know, if he sits there, White can build up and just improve his position. But he struck with rook takes pawn. This is an excellent exchange sacrifice. And I think it's particularly good at this moment when you can see the pawn on g4 is loose. b4 is loose. Suddenly this bishop is working down the diagonal. It's a very tricky position. So the game in a real state of imbalance at the moment. Rook c8, Nepo fighting back, hitting the bishop, king f8. Rook e1 protects the knight. And here Carlsen played what looks like a very natural move. He simply took on b4. And, you know, on a good day, Black could even start to get the advantage here if White isn't careful, because the pawns are so loose and Black's position is pretty compact. In fact, we'll look at the game continuation in a second. But he should have just taken here. And then king e7. And you can see those pawns are loose. It's not easy to defend both those pawns. They're both under attack. At the moment, Carlsen has a bishop and a pawn for a rook. And crucially, you can see, I think those rooks are split. Yep, split rooks. It's not a good thing. Not for White. And that makes things a little bit difficult. White's coordination is not great here. If Carlsen can snap another pawn, will certainly be safe in that position. But Carlsen played rook takes b4, which, of course, it's nice to keep the bishops, and it looks like this knight is under fire anyway. But actually, after this, h3, simple little move, just protecting the pawn. Well, you know, things still aren't so clear. Carlsen should still play king e7, and he has decent compensation. But instead he played rook takes pawn, which, you know, like I said before, I can imagine that Carlsen thought, well, maybe I'm better here. Or maybe at least there's a chance of being better. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. But here is where Nepo managed to stir things up. Knight c4, and that, of course, threatens knight d6. King e7, rook d1. And I can imagine that this is a move that Carlsen might have underestimated. Suddenly, white is threatening rook c7 with a serious attack against the king. And Nepo, from sort of out of nowhere, has succeeded in coordinating his pieces. So, for example, okay, let me make a passing move here. Let's just say h6. Then check and rook d8, and that is extremely nasty. So Carlsen comes up with the best chance here, actually. He plays rook takes knight. So a double exchange sacrifice. Of course, with this, he's hoping to build a fortress. But I think the problem from Black's viewpoint is that, or let's put it the other way round. From White's viewpoint, you know, there is always going to be the option at some point of sacrificing back one exchange and then the other rook will come in. So Carlsen always has to be aware of that. And, you know, White can build up slowly, bring the king to the middle. Sometimes a break with f5 will be good to open up lines. Sometimes simply g5, pressing on the kingside pawns. And you know, maybe later on an advance like this, h4, h5 is also a possibility. I think it's a difficult one to hold. So obviously that blocks out the f pawn. And here, I mean, I think Black should wait, but Carlsen decided to exchange pawns, which in principle is a good idea when you're wanting to try and make a draw. But actually in this case, it just allows White's rooks into the game. And now Black's king is in real trouble, trapped on the 7th rank. But as I said, I think a difficult position to hold already. And the game ended like this. Bishop e4, bishop d5. And this is almost a kind of Zugzwang, actually. For example, well, I mean, it's more than that. I mean, let's say b5, then the rook actually comes in. And this is looking decisive. King e8, rook h7. So again, it's very hard for Black to find decent moves in this position. You know, there are moves like f5, maybe just rook in and rook here, or rook f7. So it's nasty. Bishop e7 played, and now simple sack back, and the king comes in. And here Carlsen resigned. Basically, there's not a lot that can be done about it. King takes pawn. King e6, f6, and, well, that is going to cost a bishop. I mean, I found that a really intriguing struggle with Carlsen trying to sort of cement his position. You know, when that bishop came to c6, the knight on d6 here. But somehow Nepo shaking Carlsen's position and shaking the positions of Carlsen's pieces, and you know, with unusual moves like this move g4, for example, coming way back here, you know, that is a considerable risk. So yeah, we can already see quite a clash of styles. By the way, I should say that in the tournament, in this World Under 14, first was Maxime Vachier-Lagrave with 9 out of 11. He shared first with Jigalko, who was second on tiebreak. Nepo came third with 8.5, and Carlsen was a little bit back on. He came 7th with 7.5 out of 11. So at this stage, well, Nepo just a little bit ahead of Carlsen, although you can see their ratings very, very similar at this age when they're about 13. So more coming up in this series of their past games. Don't forget, like, comment, share and subscribe. Let me know, what do you think? Who's going to win in November? Everyone is saying that Carlsen is the clear favourite. Well, he is, certainly on paper. But I think there's going to be more to it. It's going to be interesting. Let me know your thoughts. And don't forget, if you want to support the channel, to check out the links to PayPal and patreon.com. Thanks for watching.